Kaimere is a distant planet. It is defined by waves of life brought from Earth and set free to evolve independently in this new context. The indigenous life of the planet, swarms of microbes called magic by the people who live there, are what harvest Earth organisms and make copies on Kaimere. As the asteroid which concluded the Mesozoic never struck Kaimere, dinosaurs remain the dominant terrestrial megafauna. There are many institutions of education and the preservation of knowledge throughout the known world. None can be compared to the vast archives and academies of the Great Library of Bolondakoi. This is a city and province built entirely around supporting the library and university. Despite its modern, imposing presence and recognition throughout the known world and beyond, the Great Library claims a humble origin, and has had numerous times throughout history nearly fallen to ruin or faded to obscurity. Throughout the known world, one can still find dozens of tunnels dug into the mountains with complex chambers within. With enchanted wards, often only descendants of the witches who created these chambers may enter. These structures, called witch holts by the Assembly, were once quite common throughout the Age of Witches. They were also common throughout the Dark Ages as most powerful witches perished, useful as a sanctuary in which many witch hunter factions and cults arose and could not enter. But witch holts are now quite rare. It was in one of these witch holts, deep within the mountains of the western Telmede Peninsula, that a library of scrolls, hides, codices, tomes, and enchanted artifacts that could retain memories were stored. While most of the accounts throughout the Age of Witches, some traced back to the Age of Demons and even the reign of the first children. Sometime during the Dark Ages, this collection was gathered and moved to a castle of a Telmede lord, Karma Alashu. Some say the wards of the Holt were broken by an earthquake. Other tales claim a witch hunter broke the seal, while other accounts also tell of the last member of the witch line, Isatu, chose to bring the collection to the noble family at the foot of the mountains, so that the knowledge would not die with her. Whatever the source, this collection would be the foundation of what is millennia later known as the largest archive of knowledge in Kaimere. The lords of House Alashu guarded Isatu's repository for centuries. Several nobles held it as a source of pride, and the family added to their collection. With their conquest by the First Sheklat Empire and the execution of the Alashu family for their resistance, the archivists who had maintained it were forced to retreat into the mountains with their most prized items. It is said they believed these were the only surviving accounts from ages past. While this has not held true and many documents have persisted over the years in other collections, this belief strengthened the resolve of the archivists. A religious reverence was built around this collection, and they amassed a robust following within the mountains. They became known as the Isatueti, Krakens of Isatu, who used ammonites as their sigil, likening the chambered spirals to their philosophy of knowledge preservation. The Isatueti don't have a singular location, and indeed spread their collection throughout much of the Telmede Mountains. With their primary focus being on preservation, there were a number of field expeditions throughout the known world and beyond to collect further knowledge. The collapse of the First Sheklat Empire was a gradual process. The southern half of the western peninsula was among the first to break free, around the Earth year 2100 BC. A vassal of the now-deceased House Alashu, House Londashu, arose as the dominant family of the region. House Londashu repaired and expanded the old holdings of House Alashu, building several trade roads to connect nearby settlements, clearing the harbor, and establishing a city now called Bolondakoi. By this time, the collection of House Alashu had become the stuff of legend, with rumors of their archives including weapons of massive and harrowing destruction. House Londashu was for a time a formidable mercantile and military presence, but not long after they were established, The war-minded Jaruma Londashu was replaced as head of the family by his younger brother Jakara Londashu. Jakara was said to have been responsible for efforts in making Bolondakoi a trade hub, convincing his elder brother to invest in roads and harbor to maintain, over adding to fortifications and expanding their holdings. Once he was in authority after his brother's passing, Jakara Londashu greatly enhanced this economic power in the region. This was aided by the discovery of tin ores in upland streams and coal and silver mines in the mountains, all of which aided in the establishment of Bolondakoi as an economic powerhouse in the region. Jakara Londashu's wife Yala was from a noble family in the mountains, and she was usually attributed to his interest in the Alashu collection later in life. Together, they amassed many artifacts and scrolls throughout the crescent, and once the silver and coal mines were depleted in the immediate area, he had them made into the foundations of deep tunnels meant to archive with greater security. Their children shared their parents' interest in the preservation of knowledge, and at some point during their reign, at least some of the Alashu collection was transferred to Bolondakoi by the Isatueti, no doubt because of pressure as other provinces and private treasure hunters in the region all began to seek it. The Isatueti were not united in trusting this family, and indeed many chapters remained independent, but much of the Alashu collection was transferred to Bolondakoi in these centuries under the promise that the Isatueti would retain authority over the collection. Especially as many in the family not only converted to the Isatueti, but often married into the cult rather than other nobility, this relationship became quite strong and the collection grew. The economic prosperity of Bolondakoi contributed to drawing in Kadanath trade from the Osatran Empire, making the Crescent Sea part of the vast network which is now called the Mercantile Age, around 3,000 years ago. Many properties throughout Bolondakoi were purchased by Kadanath nobles, and this city was arguably a holding within the Osatran Empire during this time. Trade goods from Kadan, Kajar, the Kaline Islands, Picardia, and several regions on Earth all spread throughout the Crescent. Bolondakoi often drew in these Kadanath merchant ships as their wealth made them worth a direct trade despite the eastern peninsula often being a more convenient, thanks to the eastbound winds. However, the Barren Plague reached the Crescent Sea around 1193 BC. Bolondakoi was struck hard. The Osatrans and their human slaves were violently expelled from the city, as it was Osatrans' ships which brought this horrid disease. After recovery, Bolondakoi remained an economic powerhouse in the Crescent Sea, but this was their last major connection to the realms beyond for 1,000 years. As the Dark Ages resumed, many empires rose and fell. In the Earth year 677 BC, Bolondakoi was sacked and much of the above-ground collection burned with the expansion of the Second Siridic Empire. Thankfully, the tunnel archives were secure and contained the most important relics, but this event bolstered the resolve of the Isatueti to increase investment in the security of their artifacts. More tunnels were dug, and much of the modern infrastructure being established as Bolondakoi recovered from the city's invasion. It took many centuries, and despite their surrender during the occupation of the Second Sheklat Empire, from 529 to 302 BC, they still fell short of their power and influence prior to the Siridic invasion. While most of the Crescent empires came from either the Siridic or Sheklat river basins up north, invaders from the harbor of Bolondakoi in the year 302 BC came from the mountains of the eastern peninsula. This was the Utkumetir Empire. While many cities were sacked in their expansion, these invaders offered to spare and even protect Bolondakoi in return for fealty. They had their own archives and influence from a faction of eastern Isatueti. Bolondakoi agreed to these terms. Utkubmit wasted no time in helping to restore the library and add to its great archives. Trist, a city-state which had also surrendered to Utkubmet without a fight, offered archive guards at this time, a tradition which is maintained to this day. These three cities, Bolondakoi, Utkubmet, and Trist, all had substantial presence of Isatueti, and the knowledge they revered was thought to be best kept primarily in Bolondakoi, though the other two cities retained some of their artifacts. For example, Trist is most famous for their metallurgy, including methods some claim are inherited from treatises written by the first children. It was during this time, when they were supported by the Utkubmetir Empire, that the Library of Bolondakoi went from a repository taking in artifacts to a more active organization, sending teams not only to gather items and record around the Crescent, but from a wider known world and even field expeditions beyond. While the Isatueti had conducted plenty of field missions in the past, they now had the resources to do this with greater regularity, security, and on a much larger scale. Unfortunately for Bolondakoi, the Utkubmetir Empire was not to last. From around the Earth years 200 AD to 1400 AD, the Telmede Mountains were in a regular state of conflict. Bolondakoi remained neutral and got continued support and military protection from Trist and Utkubmet, but these years were difficult and they had to greatly reduce their field work. For a brief period of time in the 800s, they were besieged by Kadanath from the Free States, no doubt seeking control of these famous archives, but the invaders were eventually routed by the Utkubmetir navy. Bolondakoi was sacked by an invasion from Sheklat in 1154 AD, largely driven by religious factions of the Riverlands that feared the potential dangers of Bolondakoi's arsenal of technology. This was vindicated by the engineers of the library deploying a number of dangerous and powerful weapons in defense of the city. While the invaders sustained thousands of casualties, they did manage to break into and burn down much of the upper library before reinforcements from Utkubmet could come to their aid. In 1412, the Second Utkubmet Empire was established after several decisive victories throughout the Telmede Mountains. As it had before, Bolondakoi joined this faction without challenge, as the three cities had maintained their alliance throughout the years of warring factions. Just as the Utkubmetir Empire braced for conflict with the Sheklat to the west, and defense of their eastern borders as the Fourth Cyritic Empire expanded into the mountains, an unexpected invader came from the north. The Chakati, a coalition of Dolani nomads and pastoralists from the northern Shu territories. Most Telmede battles were sieges that took place over months or even years. Open battle as a concept was almost unheard of, the stuff of vagabonds and savages. While the Chakati didn't excel in a siege or naval conflict, their cavalry and general mobility was unprecedented. They could arrive long before Castle and its territories were prepared or even warned. Castles might be safe once fortified, though the occasional trained Glanos proved quite capable of ripping down sections of wall and letting the cavalry in. Navies could supply coastal towns, but supply chains inland were quickly cut off. Chakati conquest of the Sheklat provinces was mostly finished over a single summer, though it must be said most Sheklat armies amassing in the south to reinforce against the Utkubmetir Empire meant the Sheklat were especially vulnerable to attack from the north. Securing the most productive farmlands in the Crescent meant the Chakati army was now supplied for a wider invasion. The Sarid held out much longer, but they too fell. As decades of warfare went on, many provinces in the mountains fell along with them. Utkubmet held fast in their resistance, as did Trist, but eventually war came to Bolondakoi. While Bolondakoi had impressive weapons at their disposal, they certainly weren't up to the sheer numbers the Chakati had at their disposal by the time the Imperial Navy arrived in their harbor. The engineers had many strange and formidable weapons within the library ready to defend their city once more. As the Bolondakoi knew little of these invaders, surrender was precarious, as they could well risk the destruction of their archives. If they surrendered, would they have to turn on their allies in Trist and Utkumet who still resisted? However, in 1533, the Chakati offered that Bolondakoi could surrender and the Asatueti would maintain control over their library. The city would need to pay taxes and distribute some of the technology they had, but mostly what was agreed upon would be means of enhancing agriculture production, not the weapons that the librarians were so reluctant to see turned upon their allies in the Eastern Peninsula. The terms were agreed upon, and Bolondakoi became a city and province of the Chakati Empire. Once the last few cities of the Western Peninsula were taken, the Empire could focus its attention entirely upon Utkumet and Trist. This conflict would take another century, but eventually the entire crescent was imperial territory. The Cyritic Wars of the 1610s were one of the many revolutions after consolidation, but as far as Bolondakoi has been concerned, their relationship with the Empire has been secure and prosperous. As it stands today, the Great Library of Bolondakoi is a massive institution which takes up a majority of the city. While it is partially funded by the Empire, which expects a return on investment, largely in the form of agricultural technology and other fields of engineering, the institution supplements with a wide range of private items that are impractical given the Empire's current level of industry, but fetch a high price from noble buyers. Their shipwrights, for example, make Shurugen ships widely regarded as the best seafaring vessels in Kaimere. They also have steam-powered carriages and other fine items which fetch a lot of revenue from wealthy buyers. The museums, zoological gardens, and other facilities throughout the Great Library also help finance the archives, as do visiting scholars looking to access information from the vaults. Bolondakoi's most famous economic foundation, however, is the university. Education at the Great Library and its satellite colleges are widely regarded as the epitome of higher education, and anyone who can afford to attend will readily do so. Tuition is affordable to imperial citizens with sufficient recommendations, but nobles are usually expected to fund the education of their own children. Colleges cover a wide range of subjects, all with robust museums focused on their respective fields. The Acquisitions and Field Research Department of the Great Library includes their most famous members. These scholars venture out into the known world and beyond, exploring ruins and wilderness, looking for artifacts and fossils to expand the material knowledge of the library. Curses, demons, and territorial beasts are just some of the dangers they must be ready to face. These rangers lead dangerous lives, but the wealth of knowledge they provide, thrill of the search, and prestige that comes with it has seen many young adventurers join acquisition teams. As we will learn over the next few weeks, the Assembly has worked with the Great Library since its introduction to Kaimere. However, there are many areas and information restricted to these human researchers. Nothing particularly against the Assembly, these are often areas which even members of the Imperial family are not permitted. This does mean that there are many gaps in the Assembly's knowledge of Kaimere's history, especially with regards to the age of the first children, demons, and witches. However, as more rangers and scholars in the Great Library join Assembly fieldwork in the 1800s and onwards, more has been shared between the two organizations. I will see you all next week as we learn about the foundation of the Assembly. This series on academic institutions in Kaimere is brought to you by the generosity of my patrons. I have a lot of sponsored episodes, but this is a subject I get a lot of questions on, and I think it might be helpful insight to the people from whose perspective these videos are presented. Without my patrons over at Patreon, I know I couldn't make unsponsored series like this, so I just wanted to be sure I extended my gratitude their way. If you're interested and able, please follow the link here or down below in the description to join Patreon. Thank you all so much for watching. Cheers, folks!